behalf of the Department of History here at Sac State, I'm very pleased to welcome you to this, which is the second of a three-part series of panel discussions that we organized in response to the change in presidential administration, the entire campaign process, and really the very large number of issues that have been taking up public attention and I think causing a certain amount of anxiety as well among the American public and among the Sac State community here as well. So I am excited for this discussion here today. I want to begin though by thanking International Programs for the use of this space. It's the second time they've been this generous, and so I'm particularly grateful to them. And I also want to remind you that the third panel discussion that's still coming up will take place on Thursday, April 13th at noon. That one will be in the Forest Suite of the University Union, and it's addressing the topic of women's activism and reproductive rights in historical perspective. So I hope you can join us for that last discussion as well. Okay. Ghana, Nigeria, Jordan, the Philippines, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Vietnam, India, Japan, Taiwan, Spain, Norway, Italy, Poland, Scotland, England, Ireland, Germany, France, Wales, Portugal, the Azores, Finland, Switzerland, Denmark, the Netherlands, Russia, Czechoslovakia, the Ukraine, Armenia, Bolivia, Ecuador, Puerto Rico, Mexico. Those 35 countries represent the countries of origin of the 45 students in my World Civilizations class this summer. And if you throw in several who trace their family roots to Native American tribes, a few more that trace them to places in West Africa that they don't know because families were brought over as slaves, forcibly brought over as slaves, we have a fairly clear picture of the extraordinary immigrant community that makes up the United States of America here today. The historical reasons that my students' families had for coming to America are as diverse as you can imagine. I'm going to share just 3 of them with you here. These are from students from the past couple of semesters. The first tells a story of early 20th century, a family hit by the genocide perpetrated by the Ottoman Empire against its Armenian minority. This student wrote, "Before my family lived in Iran, their family lived in Armenia. But due to the Armenian Genocide, my family sought safety in other countries. Death of family and friends devastated my ancestors, and through the genocide, my family was separated. Some family members went to Belgium, while my side of the family fled to Iran. The reason my grandparents went to America was to ensure that they and their future family would not face future persecution. It was a journey for safety and security rather than for pleasure." The second story is more recent. It dates from the period of World War II when the United States initiated a program called the Bracero Program, designated to recruit much-needed migrant labor for the war industry. The student wrote, "My parents come from Mexico from 2 very different sides. My father's side is native tribe and my mother's great-grandmother has more of the Spanish ancestry. My grandfather was a bracero and a few years ago was compensated for his work. My dad came here during a time of amnesty and after 25 years was fortunate to be given the opportunity to naturalize himself. My mother, though, living here a majority of her life, has not been able to become a citizen." And the last story is one from very recent decades. My parents are ethnically Egyptians and moved to the United States in 1996. During this time, both my parents were very eager to come to the United States because they had heard many great things and that America was a land of opportunities. Basically, my parents came to pursue the American dream. I ask my students for these stories every year when I teach world civilization in an effort to show them that world civilization is our civilization. And one of the themes that constantly reoccurs in these stories, they tell me, is that their families came for economic opportunity. They came to escape tyranny, seeking freedom, and many, many were searching this thing that we call the American dream. And what I find most compelling and most frustrating in America today is how little those stories seem to be dictating how we're talking about immigration in public life. And as you well know, the Republican Party initially, and Donald Trump as a candidate and as a president has made immigration and has made the question of Muslim Americans in particular a constant refrain in seeking office, and now is seeking to implement fairly vast changes in legislation in order to address what he and his administration see as a problem. There's many ways I could try and point out the administration's point of view. I decided just to pull a few quotes from President Trump's address to the joint session of Congress, which he made just last Tuesday of last week, where he said, quote, "We've defended the borders of other nations while leaving our own borders wide open for anyone to cross and for drugs to pour in at a now unprecedented rate. To any in Congress who do not believe we should enforce our laws, I would ask you this question. What would you say to the American family that loses their jobs, their income, or a loved one because America refused to uphold its laws and defend its borders?" And he said, "Our obligation is to serve, protect, and defend the citizens of the United States. We are also taking strong measures to protect our nation from radical Islamic terrorism." And finally, "It is not compassionate but reckless to allow uncontrolled entry from places where proper vetting cannot occur. Those given the high honor of admission to the United States should support this country and love its people and its values." So on the one hand, we have rhetoric that portrays immigration as economic assault and an existential threat to the nation. On the other hand, we have stories of immigrants seeking economic opportunity and freedom. And so in order to try and understand all of this, fortunately it's not my job, I've pulled together a panel of my colleagues who are all very much experts in this topic, and we're going to turn to them for the remainder of our discussion today. So I would like to begin by introducing each of them to you, and I've brought a series of questions in that I'm going to pose to them to get us started, and then we will reserve some time at the end to take your questions. I'm going to try and be more mindful of the time for those of you who were at the last talk, and save a little bit more time for those questions as well. So in alphabetical order, we'll start in the middle here. Tom Clark, wave to them so they can see. Oh. Tom Clark is a specialist in legal history who received his PhD from UCLA in 1994. His book, Defending Rights, Law, Labor Politics, and the State in California from 1890 to 1925, explores how court and police intervention in labor disputes shaped the political ideology of organized labor here in California. Dr. Clark taught history for several years at the University of Nebraska at Kearney before returning to Sacramento, where he has taught history part-time at Sac State while successfully earning his JD from McGeorge School of Law in 2005. So if you don't understand, that makes him a doctor, right? He has a PhD and a Juris Doctor. Dr. Clark is now Principal Counsel to the Assembly Judiciary Committee, where he analyzes bills on a variety of issues, including issues on constitutional law, civil rights, and civil liberties. Next to him at the end, waving to you nicely, is my colleague, Dr. Patrick Ettinger. Dr. Ettinger is professor of history here at California State. He earned his PhD from Indiana University in 2000 and began teaching at Sacramento State that same year. He regularly teaches a course on American immigration history. I think some of you here perhaps have taken that class. His award-winning book, Imaginary Lines, Border Enforcement and the History of Undocumented Immigration, 1882 to 1930, focuses on undocumented immigration of Chinese, Japanese, Europeans, Mexicans, and others across the U.S., Mexican, and Canadian borders. His current work examines the Immigration Reform Act of 1965. He directs the ongoing Immigrant Stories Oral History Project, which collects oral histories of immigrants in the Sacramento Valley region, and he's also an active volunteer with the local refugee resettlement agency, Open Doors. Last but not least, right next to me here, is Hakim Naeem. Mr. Naeem was born and grew up in Afghanistan and immigrated to Turkey because of the Afghan Civil War. Later, he moved to Europe, where he lived in refugee camps in Germany and Austria. Mr. Naeem came to the United States in 2003, studying first at Sacramento City College And then he transferred to UC Berkeley, where he was a Robert and Colleen Haas Scholar and earned his BA in Middle Eastern Studies. Currently, Mr. Naim is a lecturer at Sac State and a PhD student at UC Davis, studying Middle East history with a particular focus on Islamic nationalism, modernity, and the politicization of Islam in the late Ottoman Empire and Afghanistan. So without further ado, I'd like to pose a first question, and I'm going to address Dr. Clark to get us started here. And I want to focus in on illegal immigration right off the bat. So part of the concern of the Trump administration, and undoubtedly of many who voted for him, is with illegal immigrants who entered the United States without authorization, and who are today not legal citizens. The idea of restricting who can be a citizen of the United States, though, is almost as old as the country itself. So can you start off by telling us about the Naturalization Act of 1790, this first law to define who could be a citizen, what the law says, and maybe what the repercussions were for the United States here in California?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I guess I should stand so you can hear me a little bit better. But the Naturalization Act, the first thing to point out is that it is just the Naturalization Act. It's not an Immigration and Naturalization Act. And that's an important thing to keep in mind because there really was no federal immigration law or policy prior to the late 19th century. The first concern was with naturalization. The Naturalization Act, the 1790 Act, was very simple. It said that any alien who was a free white person could become a citizen within 2 years. And the way that they did that was to go to any court, including a state or local court, and a judge would ask them a few questions, have them take a loyalty oath, and it was a very simple process. So there's a couple of interesting things to point out about that initial act. First of all was just how simple it was. It was changed a couple of other times in the 1790s, for example, as part of the Alien and Sedition Acts, where they were worried about sort of French radicals. The period of time was extended ultimately to 14 years. A few years later, it was sort of reverted back to the 5 years, which is more or less now. A few things to note about that. Obviously, the first thing, I guess, to notice is that it was only for free white persons. So from the very beginning, citizenship and whiteness were correlated, were equated with each other. The other thing to note about it is that, again, you could do this through a local or state court. So it wasn't entirely a federal process at that time. It was sort of a Congress passed a law, and but you could go to a local judge to become naturalized. And And then the other, I should say too, that where the really big change came was in 1870, when the Naturalization Act was amended to allow persons of African descent to become citizens. And that was part of, if you take another sort of history courses, that was part of the Reconstruction, the post-Civil War Reconstruction era. It was, in a sense, in part a response to the 14th Amendment that said that anybody born or naturalized in the United States was a citizen of the United States, and it was meant to overturn a 19th century decision, Dred Scott, that suggested that blacks were not citizens. So to a certain extent, the addition of persons of African descent in 1870 was probably didn't have a big effect on blacks coming to the country. It was really done more to sort of correlate sort of naturalization law with the 14th Amendment and with other sort of areas of law. But what it did do, and this is where it's also important for California in particular, is it meant that sort of so whites and blacks could become citizens. That meant there was another category of those people who were neither white nor black who were deemed aliens ineligible for citizenship. And that was the phrase that was used over and over again, and it became a euphemism in a sense for Asians who would be, even though they could come to this country, they would still be aliens ineligible for citizenship. Anyone from Central America, Mexican Americans, for example, would have been considered white, so that it would not have been a bar to citizenship, becoming naturalized. A couple other things about that alien ineligible for citizenship. That would be a justification for other kinds of restrictions. For example, in California in 1913, the Alien Land Law, which prevented aliens ineligible for citizenship from owning or renting land. And the target of that legislation, as probably many of you know, were Japanese Americans. And that was, but the statute itself, of course, said nothing about Japanese or Asians or anything. It said aliens ineligible for citizenship could not own or rent property. So the phrase becomes a kind of buzzword for Asians, and it becomes a justification for not only restricting in terms of areas of immigration and naturalization, but also it can have consequences for people's rights within a particular state like California, in this case, the right to own land.
Let me go ahead and jump in perhaps and stop you there and turn to Dr. Ettinger, if that's okay, since we're kind of entering the time period of, that your book begins, and certainly your expertise. So maybe beginning around the era of the Chinese Exclusion Acts in the 1880s, could you talk to us a little bit about the evolution of the immigrant population in the United States, really from then up through today? I know that's no small question there.
That's right.
And maybe if you want to address any other further key pieces of law that really affected the changing demographics of the immigrant community in the United States.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming, and thanks to Dr. Siegel for organizing this historical roundtable. Basically, if you're thinking about immigration to the United States in terms of waves or periods of extended immigration, there's kind of three that are worth thinking about. One is in the 19th century, from about 1820, let's say, to about 1890, most immigrants were coming from Ireland, Germany, and Great Britain, and Scandinavia, Northern European. Around 1890, because of the industrialization that's happening in the United States, and because of the ease of transport, making it faster and easier to get from Europe, and changes in Europe, the United States saw this remarkable shift, where beginning in the 1890s, instead of Germany, England, and Great Britain being the top three countries, all of a sudden you had immigrants from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so think Southern and Eastern Europe, Jews from Poland, that the older immigrants, as they were called, continued to come, but now these quote-unquote new immigrants dominated. And that's what they called them at the time. You were living in the 1890s, and they took all these new immigrants. And what was new about the immigrants was their ethnic background, their religious beliefs, heavily Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, and Jewish, and their skill level. They tended to be much poorer and were unskilled. And they were coming now in much larger numbers. So the pace of immigration changed, where people were coming from changed, and they were poor. So that's a recipe to get yourself noticed. And so that group, and I don't want to talk about the reaction against it yet, dominated until about 1924, when the country, and we'll talk about this later, in a sort of political backlash against all this new immigrant, put in place what we call the national origin system. Some of you may be familiar with that. It basically was a system in which the government, the nation was going to give priority to people from Northern European stock. And this was a reflection of Anglo-Saxonist ideas of racial superiority. So from 1924 on, England, Ireland, Germany had these really big quotas, and other countries that had been coming in large numbers, I think Italy, Poland, Greece, had tiny little numbers. From 1924 until about 1965, the United States had this quota system in place. A certain number could come in, tilted towards Northern Europe. And that was stuck to rather tenaciously all through, for much of the 20th century. It included, as Tom referred to, also a ban, virtual ban on Asian immigration after 1924. But because of complex changes in the United States and the Cold War and other things, by 1965, at the same time as the American Civil Rights Movement, there was a decision pushed by liberals in Congress to throw away the national origin system because it was blatantly racist. And at a time in which the country was trying to get rid of the Jim Crow system, There's an analogous idea that we ought not to sort people by the color of their skin and their ethnicity, but instead by their skills and what they can bring. When they passed that, just the last wave after 1965, the 1965 Immigration Reform Act, when they passed that at the time, immigration was really low. It was a real back burner issue. And what they thought they were doing by getting rid of a demand for, by getting rid of a system that was overtly racist, they kind of thought things were going to stay the same. That is, that a lot of the European countries would still be the main senders. But instead what happened is you had a huge pulse of immigration from other parts of the world now that the door was open to them. So Asian immigration, which was 7% or so before 1965, is going to be like 35% in the period after 1965. Immigration from Africa is going to begin. Immigration from the Middle East, Iran, and other countries begin. And that is the moment we are in now. So this is kind of the last wave that has been a much more global wave of immigration. And just one other thing about that. When they reformed it in 1965, they kept the idea of having a numerical quota. Okay? We first had a numerical quota for in 1924. In other words, this is how many we want. They kept that, but they allowed a lot of openings outside of the quota. So for example, we were only supposed to have, let's say, 290,000 people a year, but if you were a refugee, you didn't count against the quota. If you were the spouse or children of somebody, so let's say an Iranian engineer came in, his spouse and family could come in, they're not counted against the quota. So what happened after 1965 is the numbers also went up again. And when you get into the 20th century, what you have is you have immigration levels now that are close to what they were in about 1910. Even though there is a numerical quota, it's far exceeded by the system that's put in place. So the biggest change I would say is, as I say, when I walk around Sac State campus, this is the Immigration Act of 1965 is what I see every day.
That's perfect, and that's actually a really nice segue because while we want to talk about immigration in general continuously here today, we did want to particularly focus in on the question of Muslim American immigrants, since that's also been a particular point of focus for the Trump administration, including just this week when the administration has announced their revised ban on refugees from now, I guess, 6 predominantly Muslim countries in the world. So I mostly want to hear from Mr. Naim, but before I pose my question, I just want to ask our legal expert quickly. Dr. Ettinger already kind of got us started, but can you just tell us a little bit, historically and legally, how it is that refugees are treated differently in the law, and also maybe in particular what's that meant in terms of Muslim American immigration to the United States?
Yeah, well, first of all, just one clarification on the order, both the first one and the second one, is that there are 2 parts of it. One was a 90-day suspension on immigration, immigrants or non-immigrants from anyone from those 7 countries originally, which now have been reduced to 6. The refugees actually was not, it doesn't apply to those 7 countries. The refugees, the suspension for refugees is for persons from any country. And that I think that, and I'm probably Hakeem can speak more personally to this difference in the law, but my understanding is that obviously legally, immigrants come in based on the criteria of the 1965 Act, which is usually some kind of family connection or job skills or something like that. Whereas a refugee, the criteria for coming in as a refugee is that you face persecution in your home country and you fear that you cannot return for your own safety to that country. So that's usually the criteria. Incidentally, the difference between refugee and asylum is what sometimes gets confused. Asylum is if you already get here, you can apply for asylum. Refugees is sort of for people outside of the country. But in terms of when this started to change, I'm not exactly sure when the United States had its first refugee laws. I know the first ones I'm aware of is right after World War II, the Displaced Persons Act, which dealt with refugees, people who were dislocated as a result of World War II. I think that was 47 or 48 that was passed. In 1980, there was a more systematic kind of refugee legislation passed, which was largely in response to Vietnam and Cambodia, and I'm sure there have been more recent sort of refugee tests, but that's my understanding of it.
Great. Well, maybe then we'll turn to you, if that's okay, Mr. Naim. And I guess where I want to start from is getting almost kind of a profile of Muslim Americans in the United States and Muslim immigrants who are not yet Muslim Americans in the United States. Maybe even kind of going back to when those very first Muslim Americans began arriving, but then certainly bringing us up to the present and the immigrant population today.
Thank you very much, Mona, and thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Can you hear me? Yeah. So I would like to go a little bit back, like way back, and start giving a history of the Muslim interest in America. So actually, the Muslim interest and Muslim connection with America or American continent starts up before the Columbus contact to America. It's a pre-Columbus time. So there are a lot of books written by Muslim scholars who lived in Andalusia, South Spain, which was from the 8th century to all the way to the Spanish Inquisition under the Muslim rule. And the books explains that how Muslims kind of passed through the dark ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, and contacted a new world. So this interest starts from that time. So a little bit, if I fast forward, when the Spanish Inquisition began and the expulsion of the Jews and Muslims, we have the laws, the Zabal, the Castile, kind of banned Muslim and Jews to coming to America or the new continent. This is another kind of, probably the first anti-Semitic Islamophobic kind of ban we can see it in history. But if we go forward in history, what we see during the rise of the chattel slavery or the race-based slavery from West Africa, almost many Muslims came or brought to America. 20% of the slaves who arrived to the new land were Muslims. Okay, we have very important examples. The one example I can give is Abdurrahman ibn Story. There's a very good documentary about him. It's called Prince Among Slaves. And he was a Muslim, and then later on they realized that he can read and write, and then he gained his freedom because he knew Arabic. Another example I can give, there's that famous slave Muslim who translated Quran for the first time for the British and in America. So as I said, more than 20 to 50,000 slaves in US, in North America, were Muslims. So but we don't have any Muslims remain from the slavery time. The current community of Muslims or Muslim immigrants came at the late 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. The first Muslims who arrived, which shows also the diversity of the community of Muslims, were Syrian Muslims. After the American missionaries opened schools in Ottoman land, Syria was part of the Ottoman Empire at that time. So this contact started, and a lot of Muslims from Syria, from Lebanon, from Istanbul, migrated to America and came here. The second group was Indian Muslims, mostly from the frontier of the Afghanistan and Pakistan. You can see the irony of the places that they are coming, and today we are banning especially those places. So this was the second group. And then the third group was the Yemenis. It is at the late 19th century that they are arriving. In California first, the Muslims from India, from Yemen, and from Ottoman lands, today's Anatolia, Turkey, arrived. But the beginning of the 20th century, we see an influx of the Russian Muslims coming from Central Asia, right? So it gives us this diversity of the diverse group for different reasons coming to America. But the biggest community of Muslims who arrived, as my colleagues in the panel talked, it was in 1960s, 1964, 1965. So you know that during the Cold War, the US wanted to create the green generation. anti-communist green generation. And U.S. brought a lot of students from Muslims, specifically from Muslim countries, to be educated in the U.S. And some of them, actually most of them, stayed here, right? And then 1980s and 1970s, we have the war, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and a large group of Afghans arrived to the U.S. And after the Iranian revolution, we see the Iranian Muslims coming to the U.S. So this history gives us like that, for different reasons, for different purposes, a diverse group of people, like any other immigrant coming to the U.S. in that sense. And this is the question of the diversity of the Muslims within the community. So let me go a little bit about the life of the Muslim community and the diversity within the Muslim community, if I'm allowed to talk about it. So, one thing is important. Muslims in America are mainly grouped by their ethnically to some degree divided. Mosques even to some degree divided by the ethnics. We have Afghan mosques, we have Pakistani mosques, we have the Arabs mosques. Although it is changing by the rise of the new generation, new first kind of Muslim American generations, they become more multicultural in terms of the new. But still, they grouped or they live together by their ethnic groups. The second thing is that there are many internal issues. So it's not a homogeneous group, okay? The one example that I can give, there's a tension between the older generation and the youth, the first Muslim American generations. I personally know father is very secular because in the 1960s, 1940s, those immigrants, to some degree, especially in the Iranian community, they're very secular, they're not religious. But the youth become more religious, maybe because of the socio-political climate of after 9/11 to some degree. They are more religious than their father. But we have to not make mistakes. Their Islam or their religion is very like American made. It has an American culture within that Islam, right? While the parents' Islam was more kind of ethnic based. The Afghan Islam or the Pakistani Islam or the Indian Islam in that sense. So there is a tension between these two generations. An example I have to give, maybe it helps you like about the hijab. The father doesn't want his daughter to wear a hijab, but the daughter wants to wear a hijab. It's like this kind of the diversity in terms of opinion, in terms of the thought, right? And the other thing, economically, Muslims are well off to some degree. Many of Muslims are like middle class or upper middle class, right? And this also reflected in the building of the mosque. In the 1960s, 70s, 80s, many of mosques were built in the inner cities. But now mosques are built in the suburbans, right? So in that style.
I'm going to ask you to wrap it up so we can keep moving. Is that okay? Or?
Okay, that's fine. One important point that, unfortunately, with all this diversity that we have within the Muslim American community, right? They are represented or presented as a homogeneous, monolithic one group, right? Which is very dangerous because it feeds what we call it Islamophobia, right? When you say it's a one group, foreign, united, you can easily dehumanize them, right? Easily put them as an outsider or treat them as an outsider. And then we might come to the question of Islam.
That's perfect, yeah. They're making all my transitions for me and making my job easy. So one topic I did want to make sure we covered today, and we'll kind of wrap it up dealing broadly with this issue, just has to do with backlash against immigration, both historically and contemporary, as Mr. Naim brought up. So, you know, when we hear the Trump administration and others who supported him talk about the perceived threat of immigration, we hear a lot about the economic threat. So, they're coming to take our jobs away, a criminal threat. They're all rapists or drug dealers. or terrorists, right? They're coming here to destroy America. And so I guess I want to start with Dr. Ettinger more broadly. If you could talk to us a little bit about almost the history of the fear of foreigners in the United States, and then maybe we'll come back to Mr. Naim and look specifically at the question of Islamophobia today.
All right, good. First thing I think it's important to say is that in the contemporary world in which we live, we see the sort of nativism sprouting up in lots of places besides the United States, right? Europe is wrestling with the same issue. And ultimately, I think a lot of the reaction against immigrants historically is a certain kind of tribalism, right? There's us and the others. In the United States, it's a long history of nativist sentiment, and unsurprisingly, the upsurges of it kind of track along with patterns of immigration. So I'll just say three really quickly, really broadly. The first really strong period of anti-immigrant sentiment came about in the 1840s, and that was in response to large numbers of Catholic immigrants, principally Irish, but also some German. And that led to a very strong, if regionally in the Northeast strong, movement known as Know-Nothingism, the formation of the American Party, which galvanized support around the issue that Catholics were unfit to live in the Republic. They were unfit because they were loyal to the Pope rather than ready for Republican citizenship. And they had objections to other things that the Irish and the Germans brought with them, including the fact that they drank on Sundays and didn't observe Sabbath laws. And there were a lot of ways in which they were construed to be a threat, but primarily, interestingly, it was this idea that they were not ready to live in a republic. They were threatened as well by the fact that they wanted to have their own parochial schools, a lot of issues. That kind of peters out during before the Civil War. Think of it as a third party that kind of comes up, makes immigration a central issue, wins some governorships, and then kind of goes away. The Civil War took precedence. Then I told you about the new immigrants that came from Southern and Eastern Europe in the 1890s and onward, and at the same time that they were arriving, you had this huge growing backlash against them that lasted about 30 years until it culminated in that National Origins Act I told you about in 1924. There, the objections to the immigrants were kind of threefold. A very strong component of it was racial. And at the time, of course, they talked about race in a different way than we do. And they thought of groups like Greeks and Poles and Irish and Italians as race. And at the same period of time in the United States, there was a rising belief in something we call Anglo-Saxonism, which essentially is just the idea that people with Anglo-Saxon blood are naturally superior, better suited for democracy, and basically destined to rule the world. If you believed in Anglo-Saxonism, and not every American did, but many did, then you looked at the new immigrants and thought, oh my God, what are we letting in? We're letting in these weaker, inferior, non-white peoples who also happen to be increasingly Catholic, Greek Orthodox, and Jewish. So it was a movement that got very strong. You saw the Immigration Restriction League in the 1890s pushing for reforms, limits on immigration. You saw the American Protective Association. That was, until today at least, what I consider to be the high water mark of nativism in the United States. I'm skipping over, for those of you wondering why I'm not talking about the Chinese Exclusion Act, that also was an intense form of nativism. It was specific here to California, so I'm kind of going broadly. And that nativism in the 1890s, 1900s, again, had a racial component to it. It also had a political component to it. And there was a fear that the new immigrants were coming from countries where they didn't have democratic experience, and that they were not suited for it intellectually, and fears that they would, vote irresponsibly and not be good citizens. And there's also a fear, so we're talking about the new immigrants, about the political ideas they were bringing with them. Anarchism, socialism. As a matter of fact, in the 1903 Immigration Reform Act, it bans anarchists specifically. So you start to have a fear that they're racially inferior and maybe bringing in some difficult ideas. And of course, there was also the economic foundation for opposition for some of them as well. And that was the last real strong pulse. In the middle of the Cold War and the Red Scare era in the 1950s, you had, not in the national public opinion, but among policymakers concerned about communist subversives, and so you see some tweaks to the law, making it excludable if you belong to a subversive organization. And it's really not until the 1990s when you started to see these English language only state referendum that you began to get a sense that there was a cultural shift of antagonism towards Native Americans and, immigrants, and you began to see the issue of undocumented immigration emerge as a kind of a subset of nativism. And that built through the 1990s, 2000-aughts, and here we are today. And 9/11 obviously was a very important context of adding yet another sort of fear. So we're living in a period that your grandchildren will suffer through history classes and having it be compared to the 1890s in its earlier waves.
Mona, can I add one point?
Of course you may.
It has to do with the California angle, and you mentioned it, but one of the things when I teach my California history, and I just went over this a couple weeks ago, prior to the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1982, California State Senate had sent a memorial to Congress asking them to restrict immigration. And it's interesting to look at that report. My students read this report. It talks about the criminals, it talks about the economic part, but it also, the phrase that they kept using over and over again in California, and I hate to even say, and I can never really get this word out of my mouth, it's so hard to say, but it was that they were unassimilable. They lacked the capacity for assimilation. And some of the phrases in that memorial: incapable of adaptation to our institutions, never desire to become citizens or to perform the duties of citizenship. Well, it would have been hard to perform the duties of citizenship if you were denied the right to become a citizen. No evidence of a single genuine conversion to Christianity. No desire to adapt to our educational system. So after my students read that, I put this following quote up on the board, and I asked them to say, or on a PowerPoint actually, and asked them to say who said it. We should only admit into this country those who share our values and respect our people. We must also screen out any who have hostile attitudes toward our country or its principles. Assimilation is not an act of hostility, but an expression of compassion. Our system of government and our American culture is the best in the world and will produce the best outcomes for all who adopt it. So there you see that sort of same thing is you have to have this capacity to assimilate to our values and our institutions and so on and so on. So I asked my students, I said, what's the source of that? Who do you think said that quote? And they all raised their hand and said something like, well, Dennis Kearney, who was the head of the Working Men's Party in of California, or B.S. McClatchy, who was a racist here in California, sort of Asian generally. But given the genesis for this panel, who do you think said that? That guy in the White House said that. So it is amazing that there's another sort of theme that goes through all of this is this notion of an incapacity to assimilate to our values, and that's when you listen to the rhetoric about Muslim Americans in particular. That's one of the things that comes up, right? Is that somehow their way of thinking is so foreign or so contrary to our values that they can't be.
Can I make a point?
Absolutely, yes.
Like basically what Islamophobia is, the fear and the nativism, the correlation of the fear and how can I say this nativism and racism together. So let me give a brief description or definition of Islamophobia, what Islamophobia is. Islamophobia is a contrived fear or prejudice generated by existing European and Orientalist global power structure and strategically directed at group of the people, right? This is specifically now it works for Islam, but it has a broader connotation in that. Islamophobia reintroduces and reinforces epistemologically the existing global racial structure through which resource distinction and distribution maintained and extended. Therefore, Islamophobia provides an important tool to the power structure, right, in a broader sense, in order to keep this racial disparity intact. And we talked about it. The citizenship began with this, the whiteness was very important in that sense. So let me give an example. When we say this argument that Muslims are a threat to our borders, right? Or we say that immigrants automatically we can make it immigrants as a threat to our borders and our security, which is made during the Bush era in media. The argument was that Muslims are crossing the Mexican border and coming to the United States, right? So any dark person in that sense can be treated as a Muslim. Okay, this is very important part of that. And if you look at the force that today is behind Islamophobia, many of them, probably 50 years ago, could have been very anti-Semitic, right, and racist forces. It's very much similar. It's connected in that extent. So fear, race, and nativism, it's very combined when we define or think about Islamophobia.
Thank you so much. So we even had a few more questions here, but I'm gonna stop directing this here because I want to give all of you an opportunity to ask our panelists some questions. So I'll go ahead and call on people. If you could raise your hands, if you could just speak really loudly so that we're all sure to hear the question.
I'd like to offer two perspectives, two assertions, and then ask a couple of quick questions. The first is the thought I've had for a while that the United States historically is an experiment in whether the human race can live in peace through the practice of democracy. It's an open question. We're still working on it. The second is that there are cultures around the world that are characterized by either a high or a low tolerance for uncertainty. Think Japan, in which everything is very organized, Germany, in contrast to China or England, where things are, we're not quite sure how the future will be, but we can handle it. So my first question is there anything characteristic of Islam that is either highly tolerant of future uncertainty or highly intolerant of future uncertainty, or does it remain culture specific? And then secondly, from those several perspectives, how should we be talking with other people to help build the one country that is all of us? Thank you.
Do you want to try to address that first? Or?
Yeah.
Go ahead and stand up.
So, this is a good question, thank you, and a very interesting question in that sense. So, I think if we think about Islam within this like a binary or dichotomic binary of like tolerance, intolerance, peace or violent, right? We create a characteristic for the Islam, right? For the Islam that can easily be exploited. My sense. So Islam, let me give an example. During this slavery time, right? The pro-slavery forces and anti-slavery forces, both of them could use Bible, and they used Bible for their argument. So here, it's very important to think about Islam within this binary dichotomy. So Islam is a religion of peace? Or is Islam is a religion of violence? This is the questions that I think to some degree freezes the complexity within like the thinking of Islam. Because it's very diverse, it's very changeable, it is very adaptable, right? Is Muslims in Afghanistan are similar, doing the same thing that the Muslims doing in China? If we look at as homogeneous thing, no, I totally understand your question, and your question is like, but I'm trying to come up with a different methodology when we think about Islam in that sense. I don't know if it answers it.
Do either of you want to chime in on that one?
My answer.
I agree.
If I could just add one thing in response to kind of your second question, which is what do we do in terms of building a multicultural democratic society globally as well as in the United States. I wish I could just come up with a perfect solution, and I don't know if any of us here can, but I do have to say, speaking as a historian, understanding that the threats that we feel like they're unique in the world and nobody's ever experienced them before, or the idea that our country is changing and it's never happened before, I think understanding that historically America has gone through these stages and cycles, and while history doesn't repeat itself exactly, understanding that we came out of them too. And understanding that part of that was recognizing that every population that was seen as unassimilable, I can't say it either, proved to be assimilable in the end, right? And so taking that, I'm not always an optimist these days, but that's like a little piece of optimism, I think, is that this generation, like the ones before it, can come out the other end. So, are there other questions that we can take here? I'll get you next. No, go ahead, Ken, and then I'll get the next one.
I think I'm going to be directing this to Dr. Clark, which has to do with the legal issue of the recent executive order. Looking back historically, in 1952, Congress passed legislation that authorized the president to be able to exclude members of certain groups perceived to be a danger. And in 1979, Jimmy Carter, who was president at the time, used that authorization to not only exclude Iranians from entering in the United States, but deporting up to what I think it was 15,000 of them, or upwards above that. But he was, not excluding all Muslims, just, particularly what was perceived to be a threat to the United States, revolutionaries from Iran. So, in looking at the president's executive order, unlike what he might have said during the campaign, it doesn't seem to be a total Muslim ban, because the 6 nations in question only cover, less than 15% of the worldwide Muslim population. But it's, he gears it toward a perceived danger of, these countries can't properly vet them. We might be bringing in, possible terrorists or something like that. Is he acting in his proper legal capacity as given by the legislation of 1952?
He might be acting under the legislation of 1952. He might not be acting under the legislation of 1965 that prohibited discrimination. But you're absolutely right that there is the question of the discriminatory nature of those executive orders is much more complicated than the way that it's oftentimes been discussed, frankly, by both sides in the media. But in terms of, it is true, for good or bad, that the president does have pretty substantial power when it comes to issues of not only of immigration but also of national security and so on and so forth. But in terms of the constitutionality of it, I think there's a number of ways in which it can be challenged. When the Ninth Circuit Court heard the first one, they did, that question of, well, can you consider statements that were made during the campaign or an alleged statement that was made to Rudy Giuliani as speaking to the motive of it. And generally speaking, when courts interpret statutes, they certainly look to legislative history and you can look to those things. They're not, in this case, it wouldn't be very strong evidence. So I think in the Ninth Circuit, it was more, the order didn't even really, in some ways, pass a kind of rational basis sort of test, right? I mean, there was no, if the concern was in response to terrorist attacks in the United States, then the ban should have been on countries where people who committed terrorist acts had come from. And in fact, none of them were in those 7 countries, right? So in that sense, I don't think it did. And then the other thing to keep in mind about the recent case is that it was really very limited. It really wasn't on the merits of the case. It was on whether or not the stay should continue, and that's a different set of sort of legal questions.
I think we're going to let Mr. Naeem answer that as well, and then I'll take your question.
Just one point about the vetting, but because it's coming all that those countries cannot properly vet, right? I just want to share a personal kind of story of experience. I'm a U.S. citizen. I became a U.S. citizen in 2007. My mom, I applied for my mom. Afghanistan, it's one of the most broken country probably. everything is like ruined, like there's a lot of corruption, as probably most of you know by the media. It took 3 years for my mom to be vetted. And she was 76 years old, okay? Multiple tests, more than 15 tests, including a DNA test by me and her, okay? And that was during the Obama time, right? And the media says that, well, Obama opened the door and everybody came. This was just an example of that. What do really mean by extreme vetting when we say the extreme vetting? The second thing about the part of that, is it a Muslim ban and threat? We have to think about what the threat is from these countries that were banned, mostly the majority of the Muslims. But and one thing about racism is very important. Racism cannot be like totally 100% inclusively targeting like people. Can we say that blacks cannot enter blacks who live in inner cities cannot enter some restaurants? Well, it does not include all blacks, but just who lives in the inner city. But it's still racism. My point is that it doesn't have to be exclusively include all 100% of that group.
Great.
Sorry.
No, don't apologize. Thank you. Let's go ahead and have another question.
In the article, it essentially says that you need to know your enemy and know yourself before going into combat. And I feel like I don't know enough about the international affairs to really like understand what they're doing, but are they really doing their job when dealing with like foreign people? Like, can we do better as a country to just really before like doing anything, crushing and like just having an iron fist with things?
So I'm sorry, when you're saying are they doing their job, is they the government, the United States government?
Yeah, the international affairs.
And when you say doing better, do you mean doing better at being more open or doing better at
Just understanding a situation before acting on it.
Oh.
It seems like
Understand your enemy before you act against them in some way. So are we acquiring the knowledge necessary to defend ourselves before issuing restrictions? Is that?
Well, I'll take a stab at that. It's a great question. When I think about things, I think about them historically. And one of the things that disturbed me about the present order to do this is that history doesn't repeat itself, but it echoes. And there are echoes here of bans targeting the Chinese and the Asians and setting aside groups and treating them differently. So that's what kind of alarms me about this. And the other thing that makes me think that maybe the administration in setting up this particular group of nations hasn't done its due diligence, hasn't really thought about it carefully, is the fact that one of the leading influences on our president, Steve Bannon, is openly someone who's embraced Islamophobia, and I'm certain that his hand is on this, right? And so that worries me. I also work here in Sacramento on a volunteer basis with refugees, and just want to echo what he said. They're so superbly vetted. It's just a fiction that we even have to say, oh, they're not vetted. We're just echoing a fiction. They're extremely well vetted. The ones I'm dealing with now are mostly from Afghanistan, and they're people that helped the troops or American contractors over there, and it's sort of laughable. So I don't feel like at this particular moment we're being well served by our leaders in terms of crafting an intelligent response to a dangerous world.
Okay, how about right in the front row here?
My question is for Dr. Clark. I was wondering if you can kind of explain the executive order process. Is it just like an end-all be-all, or does Congress actually?
Well, that's a great question, and I've been spending most of the last 2 weeks trying to think about that, because I've been preparing summaries of the executive order for our members. But the power of the president to issue an executive order, there is no inherent power. Well, this is one of the things that was tried, that people in support of them try to claim. There really is no inherent power of the president to issue an executive order. The courts have decided, starting in 1952, there was a case where Harry Truman tried to seize steel mills. has said that there's no inherent power. The power has to be rooted in either a statute by Congress or a provision of the Constitution. And usually the only provision of the Constitution that really is relevant is the Commander-in-Chief. So it has to be rooted in that. There's not like some general floating power. And the executive orders have to be consistent with the statute that they're based on. If they're based on a statute, as most of them will be, most of the immigration orders were. They have to be, even if they're consistent with the statute, they still have to be consistent with the Constitution. For example, you can't violate the Equal Protection Clause and the Due Process Clause for an executive order. But it's part of it. It's a very complicated area of law because most statutes don't spell out in detail how the law will be carried out. Right? The classic separation of powers. Right? Congress makes the laws and the executive branch executes them. So they leave to the administrative and the executive branch, the ability to do those details. Usually the way that's done is that an administrative agency develops rules and regulations, and there's a whole public process in which that has to be done. So executive orders should be simply a directive to a federal agency or federal employees how to execute a law that is passed by Congress. And that leaves a lot of gray area, obviously, in terms of what kind of when does the execution of the law can it be executed in such a manner that's inconsistent with the spirit of the law. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
And what happens if, I read that some of Trump's executive orders have violated the Constitution?
Well, none of them have been found to yet, right? I mean, but I think a lot of them certainly seem to me to exceed any kind of statutory authority that might be, like the one that would sort of waive environmental review of certain high priority infrastructure projects. I'm not sure that can really be done consistent with the laws passed by Congress. But it's hard to say. I mean, there's certainly one of the things that the administration tried to argue in the Ninth Circuit case was that executive orders aren't reviewable. Well, that's just nonsense, right? I mean, that you generally give deference to the executive, especially on national security issues. But by definition, if you're giving deference, you're giving deference in the process of review. So this notion that it was unreviewable was just absolute nonsense. And the court pointed that out to them as well. None of them have been declared unconstitutional yet. I mean, I don't, like anything with the Constitution, to say affirmatively that something is or isn't constitutional is almost impossible. The court says it is, it is. The court doesn't say it's not, it's not.
Are there other questions? How about right here in the Hornets sweatshirt?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Mr. Naeem. Earlier you mentioned about the generation gap between the old and the new Muslims. I just want to know, could you explain more what you perceive as American Muslims? Is it more going back to the foundation of Islam, or is it?
No, it's more kind of like being born in this country, right? And adopt a certain culture, which, like many new generation, or I should say American Muslim generation who are born here, they are kind of distinct from their parents, like cultural aspect of Islam, right? They were born here, grew up here, they know less about Pakistan or Afghanistan. So the affairs of Pakistan or Afghanistan does not interest them in that sense. But within themselves, as a Muslim, when they go to school, when they go to colleges, when they come together, they have this culture, American culture within themselves, because they are part of the society. And they try to incorporate that with Islam, especially after the 9/11, because 9/11 kind of created a new consciousness for the youth, for the Muslims, because they faced suddenly a discrimination be out. Although they are very much they are part of this, they are American in that sense. This is why, what I say, there's a difference by that, more culturally, because it is very important to notice that Islam like very much adopts different cultures as a part of its practices, right? So this American culture, hip hop, for example, right? A lot of Muslims, Americans, like the hip hop culture is very much part of their life. That make sense?
Yeah, is there a, like, do you think they're ever going back to the basic foundation of Islam, like within like the beginning of Muhammad, or is that just
Well, they study they want to learn, especially in this climate, the foundation of Islam. Of course, the Islam in that sense, what it preaches, what it practices. But what I'm saying, the differences is the culture, right? And even the young generation who came like when they were 12 or 14 to America, I can see that differences with their parents as well, right?
If I can just add to that, I have a 14-year-old son who just announced to me the other day that apparently Nike is coming out with a hijab now. That's, you know, suited for sporting and all of that. So the blending of a capitalist American culture with Islam, I think.
Sorry to interrupt you.
No, that's
and another
okay.
thing is, like, for the immigrant generation, when you come to that a country, right, to some degree, some kind of like discriminate, because you, especially talking from the people who came from Afghanistan, they flee the war, right? They flee the frustration. They flee like the kind of harsh, brutal killing. Some discrimination does not bother them, but for the youth, it's a big thing because they are part of it, right?
does that cause like a generation gap between the two?
To some degree, yes. To some degree, yes. So, like, if you go to some mosques, like ethnically based mosques, most of the time, if the oldest dominated the executive board or the running of the mosques, the youth is like kind of like out. But when the youth took the executive board, the youth are going to that mosque more. There's that kind of potential. So the school mosque, for example, is mostly run by the youth, right? The college mosques. And they built one in Berkeley, the youth. So, and that's more like multi-ethnic than specifically in one ethnic. This is another difference in the function.
Yes, sir.
Uh,
No, I'm sorry. 1 second. I'll take you next, okay?
I want to get first a comment. We hear this narrative of America as a nation of immigrants. Obviously, as one group of people, my ancestors who brought here to California State. And what your thoughts of that? And obviously, being partially being rapist. And could you also talk about after slavery ended, when we see again an uptick as far as West African immigration to America, and how that has played into the relationship between both African and African Americans connection, and then from the perspective of Muslim Americans, what do you estimate as far as the population? Because the numbers have always been skewed, and there's no real accurate way in anything in terms of understanding statistics. What is the actual number of Muslims? Because there are people who become Muslims every day. It's the fastest growing religion in the world, particularly here in America. And you have many sort of unidentified or closet Muslims that exist.
Yeah.
So when you add in all these numbers, like that number, do you feel that because of that growth, that it's much more of this threat that feeds into Islamophobia?
Why don't we start with Dr. Ettinger?
Okay, yeah, quickly. So, Black African migration to the United States really doesn't become significant in number until after the 1965 Act. When Congress made those discriminatory national origins quotas in 1924, they kept all the African, the entire continent of Africa was 100 per year. And so that quota is in place until 1965. So 100 per year is the same as saying nobody, as far as I'm concerned, numerically. And it's really going to be, I think, in the as he pointed out, some of the earlier immigrants from Africa were elites, were university students that were being given an opportunity to come here and study. Many of them stay. That becomes kind of the basis for a community. And then when you have wars in the 70s and 80s, as as there now is a possibility for people to move, some people begin to move here, building on those family ties. And here in Sacramento, this area, I know there's a small but growing population of African immigrants. I'm not, as expert on that as I could be, but basically the answer is it's a long time coming from the end of slavery until you start seeing black Africans come.
Okay, in terms of the statistics, it's like a little bit hard to give an exact number, right? Because in censuses, you don't ask for the religion as much as they do, right? When the census comes. But when Pew Research kind of finds that the number of Muslims are slightly over 3 million in the US, so which kind of like 1% of the population. If we base the population of the United States 300 something, 320 or something like that. So it's less, or let's say almost to 1% of the population. In terms of the immigrant population that are coming, it's like about 10% of the immigrants are coming from are Muslims or coming from the Muslim countries. So how fast, but this is important. You made a really interesting point. The Muslim populations in America, it's a very young, very vibrant, right? And in terms of economy, as I say, they're well off to some degree. So there's an estimate that by 2050, the numbers of the Muslims will double if it goes to that, to probably 2%, 2.5%. And still, it's nothing in that term of like bigger, if you say. But for the Islamophobes, it's a big thing, right? For the Islamophobes, it's like alarming that, well, these people are coming and they are growing past in that sense. But as I say, this is very, very, like not exact kind of statistic, but close to precise statistic that I can give.
Can I add one point to that?
Absolutely. I think we'll take one more question here at the front, and then we'll probably have to wrap up.
It's a great question about how do you count this, because, and Patrick can probably say more about this, but there's a historian by the name of May Naim who's written about how they calculated the national quotas, right? It was like 3% of this group's population in the United States as of 1910 or something like that. And according to her, they passed this law, but they never really figured out how to really calculate it, right? Because it's somebody who married an Irish person who married a Swedish person, how would you count them? I mean, well, how would you even do that, right? So it's a great question, and I don't know that they ever actually resolved how to figure out how to.
I think they came up with a methodology that I've never really understood. It took about 5 years until they calculated it, but I don't, and I'm familiar with Nate's guys' work, and that's probably the best explanation I still don't quite understand.
I just want to chime in. I think probably one of the toughest questions that I've ever received from a student in a world civilizations class was a student who came up to me after the class was over. I don't even know what we've been talking about, but he was an American, but he was from an Ethiopian immigrant family. And he said to me, "Professor Siegel, am I an African American?" Because he knew he was from Africa, and he knew he was American, but he also knew that there was a whole set of cultural identities that one would be an African American that he wasn't sure if they applied to him. And I have colleagues in the room who could have answered the question better than whatever I mumbled through, but I thought that was very, very interesting because we do think of the African American population as largely going back 200, 300 years.
For every African I ask that question to, they say they're African American.
They say yes. Well, I think in the end I told them that was his choice, right? But yeah. Okay, we have a question here at the front. Yes.
Yes, I was just. Is there anything hardcore historically we can use? I know Morocco was at least arguably one of the first countries to recognize the independence of the U.S. Are there any mosques that have been here for 150 years? Are there any long-term relationships with Morocco? Anything like that we can trust in?
So you're asking about information that you might want to have on the tip of your tongue about the long roots of Muslim American citizenship?
So,
citizenship interaction.
I don't know, like really probably there is, but I know in California, some mosques like built in the late 19th century. I found a document about the frontier Afghan leader of the Californian Muslim community in 1911 visited Ottoman Empire, right? And he was like greeted as a leader of the Muslim community in America. So the mosque at that time, not in a very, how can I say, architectural style of the Middle Eastern style mosque, but some like small mosque built probably 100 years ago, and I don't know 150, but 100 years ago in California, I know that a building for the purpose of to be used as a mosque was built.
There was nothing from our Moroccan friends dating from the
No, the Moroccan friends. One thing was I can say that during the 18th century, late 18th century, 19th century, whatever was like, there's a kind of because Morocco like recognized, whatever there was like in terms of Muslim slave issue, they would ask Morocco country. For example, the Muslim slave who gained his freedom, the prince among slaves, he was from West Africa, but he was sent from Morocco because he was called Muhammadan, or he's Muslim. In this term of relationship with Morocco, there was existing.
If I could please ask all of you to join me in thanking our panelists for being here.